The manila envelope landed on Claire Morrison's desk with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the cramped Henderson and Associates law office. Morning light filtered through yellowed Venetian blinds, casting golden stripes across the papers scattered around her workspace. She looked up from her computer screen, pushing a strand of red hair behind her ear as attorney Harold Henderson loomed over her desk. "Divorce papers for the Whitman case," Henderson said, his voice carrying the same disinterested tone he used for all routine matters. "Need them served by Friday? No exceptions." His thick fingers drummed impatiently on the envelope's edge. "The woman's been avoiding service for 2 weeks. Lives at 847 Maple Street." Claire's breath caught in her throat. 847 Maple Street. The old Victorian house where she'd spent countless childhood afternoons walking past, dreaming of the elegant family that must live behind those tall windows and wraparound porch. The same house her own family had once admired before everything fell apart, before they lost their own home to foreclosure when she was 16. The office door chimed as David Chen entered, still wearing his mechanic's coveralls from his morning shift at Murphy's garage. Oil stains darkened the fabric around his hands, and his dark hair was slightly mussed from working under car hoods. Claire had seen him around town but never really noticed how his presence seemed to fill the small space, making the cluttered office feel even more cramped. Their eyes met across the room, and something unexpected flickered between them. Not recognition exactly, but something deeper, like finding a familiar melody in a stranger's voice. David nodded politely, but his gaze lingered on her face for just a moment longer than necessary. "This is David Chen, our process server," Henderson said without looking up from his appointment book. "David, this is Claire Morrison, our paralegal. She'll give you the details on the Whitman service." Henderson dropped the envelope and walked toward his private office, already dismissing them both from his attention. Claire picked up the papers, feeling their weight. Not just the physical documents, but the emotional burden of what they represented. Someone's marriage ending, someone's life changing forever. "The address is familiar," she said, handing David the envelope. "I know the neighborhood pretty well. Mrs. Whitman lives in that big Victorian at the end of Maple Street. You can't miss it." David accepted the papers, his calloused fingers brushing hers briefly. "Thanks. Henderson mentioned she's been hard to reach. Any idea why she might be avoiding service?" Claire shook her head, but something nagged at her memory. The Whitman name seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd heard it recently. Maybe she just doesn't want to face reality. Divorce papers make everything official, you know? "Yeah, I get that." David's expression softened with understanding. Nobody wants to sign the end of their marriage. As David turned to leave, Claire noticed how he moved with careful precision, like someone accustomed to handling delicate things that could break if mishandled. The office felt smaller after he left, and quieter in a way that made her suddenly aware of the old building's settling sounds. She was still thinking about the brief encounter when Henderson emerged from his office 20 minutes later, carrying another manila envelope. This one was thicker, sealed with the kind of official red tape that meant serious legal documents. "Almost forgot," he said, dropping the second envelope on her desk. "These go with the Whitman papers. Eviction notices. Same address, same deadline." Claire stared at the envelope, her stomach sinking. Eviction notices? But David already left with the divorce papers. Henderson shrugged, already heading back toward his office. "He'll figure it out. Process servers handle multiple documents all the time." He paused at his door, looking back with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Whitman's got bigger problems than just divorce, apparently. Husband cleaned out their accounts before he left. House is going into foreclosure." The door closed behind him with a decisive click, leaving Claire alone with the weight of what she'd just learned. David was walking into that beautiful Victorian house with divorce papers, completely unaware that he was about to destroy not just Mrs. Whitman's marriage, but her entire life. Claire grabbed her yellow cardigan from the back of her chair and reached for her purse. Whatever professional boundaries existed between process servers and paralegals, she couldn't let David walk blindly into a situation that would devastate an elderly woman who was already losing everything. Main Street Diner buzzed with the usual lunch crowd when Claire found David sitting in a corner booth, the manila envelope resting beside his coffee cup. The familiar sounds of small-town conversation filled the air. Discussions about weather, local high school football, and whose garden was producing the best tomatoes this season. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, sliding into the opposite seat before he could answer. David looked up from the legal documents he'd been reviewing, surprise flickering across his features. "Of course. Everything okay?" Claire glanced around the diner, noting how conversations seemed to quiet slightly when people noticed them together. In a town like Millbrook, new pairings always drew attention, especially when one person worked for the law firm that handled half the town's legal troubles. "There's something Henderson didn't tell you about the Whitman service," she said, keeping her voice low. "Something important." David set down his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. The intensity of his focus made her suddenly self-conscious, aware of how close they were sitting in the small booth. "After you left, Henderson gave me eviction papers for the same address. Mrs. Whitman isn't just getting divorced. She's losing her house, too. Her husband apparently emptied their bank accounts before he left." David's jaw tightened, and something dark flashed in his eyes. "So she's been avoiding service because she knows what's coming." "Probably. And David, I know this sounds unprofessional, but I think we should approach this differently. Maybe go together. Try to handle it with some compassion. This woman's whole world is falling apart." Before David could respond, Martha Jenkins appeared beside their table like a storm cloud gathering overhead. Martha had lived in Millbrook her entire 73 years and considered herself the unofficial keeper of the town's moral standards. "Well, well," Martha said, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for announcing scandals. "The city lawyer and her muscle, planning strategy over coffee. I suppose this is how things get done nowadays. Plotting in diners instead of courtrooms?" Several nearby conversations stopped entirely, all attention focusing on their booth. Claire felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "Mrs. Jenkins, we're just discussing a routine legal matter," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. Martha's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, I'm sure it's very routine. Just like it was routine when the Hendersons foreclosed on the Miller farm last spring, or when they helped tear down the old church for that parking lot." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that carried perfectly throughout the diner. "Word of advice, dear. People in this town have long memories. We remember who fights for us and who fights against us." She straightened up and walked away, leaving behind a wake of uncomfortable silence. Claire stared at her coffee, wishing she could disappear into the worn vinyl booth seat. "Don't let her get to you," David said quietly. "She's like that with everyone who doesn't fit her idea of how things should be." Claire looked up at him, surprised by the understanding in his voice. "You've dealt with her before?" "I'm the outsider mechanic who dared to open a shop in her perfect little town. According to Martha Jenkins, I represent everything wrong with modern society." He smiled, but it didn't quite hide the hurt beneath. "My grandmother used to say that some people need someone to look down on to feel better about themselves." Something in his voice when he mentioned his grandmother made Claire want to know more. But before she could ask, David was sliding out of the booth. "Come on," he said, leaving money on the table for both their coffees. "Let's go see Mrs. Whitman, together." The Victorian house at 847 Maple Street stood like a fated queen, holding court over the neighborhood's more modest homes. Paint peeled from the elaborate trim work, and the wraparound porch sagged slightly on one side. But the bones of the house remained magnificent. Tall windows caught the afternoon light, and ancient oak trees shaded the overgrown garden. Claire stopped at the front gate, memories washing over her like a tide she couldn't control. "I used to walk past this house every day after school," she said softly. "I'd imagine the family inside. Maybe a grandmother who baked cookies, children playing piano in that front parlor, Sunday dinners around a big wooden table." David studied her face, seeing something vulnerable in her expression that made his chest tight. "What happened to your family's house?" "Foreclosure. When I was 16. Dad's construction business failed when the economy crashed, and we lost everything." She pushed open the gate, its hinges creaking in protest. "That's why I became a paralegal. I thought maybe I could help people navigate the legal system that destroyed us." They walked up the front steps together, their footsteps echoing on the old wooden boards. David noticed how Claire's hands trembled slightly as she approached the door, and he found himself wanting to protect her from whatever pain this place represented. The doorbell's chime seemed to echo through the house for a long time before they heard footsteps approaching. When the door opened, Claire's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman was exactly what she'd imagined as a child, an elegant woman in her 70s, wearing a faded floral dress that had probably been beautiful 30 years ago. Her silver hair was pinned back in a neat bun, and despite the circumstances, she carried herself with the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of facing difficulties with grace. "Good afternoon," Mrs. Whitman said, her voice warm despite the wariness in her eyes. "Are you here about the library position? I've been waiting for word about my application." David's hand hesitated on the manila envelope, and Claire saw the exact moment his professional composure cracked. Mrs. Whitman's mention of the library job, her voice so full of hope, made what they had to do feel like a betrayal of the worst kind. "Mrs. Whitman," David said gently, "I'm afraid we're not here about the library. I'm David Chen, a process server, and this is Claire Morrison from Henderson and Associates. We have some legal documents that require your signature." The hope in Mrs. Whitman's eyes flickered like a candle in wind, but she maintained her composure with practiced grace. "Of course. Please come in. I'll put on some tea." The interior of the Victorian house was even more beautiful than Claire had imagined as a child, though she could see the subtle signs of financial strain: faded wallpaper, worn carpet edges, empty spaces where valuable items had once sat. Mrs. Whitman led them into a parlor where afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. "I must apologize for the state of things," Mrs. Whitman said, settling into a wingback chair that had probably been expensive decades ago. "I've been doing some spring cleaning, getting rid of things I no longer need." Claire recognized the euphemism. Her own mother had used similar language when they'd been forced to sell family heirlooms to pay bills. The spring cleaning was really about survival, selling anything valuable to keep the lights on and food on the table. David sat forward in his chair, the envelope still unopened in his hands. "Mrs. Whitman, before we proceed, I want you to know that we understand this is difficult. These are divorce papers from your husband's attorney." Mrs. Whitman's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer, the only sign of her inner turmoil. "I've been expecting them," she said quietly. "Harold, my husband, he left 3 months ago. Said he needed space to think, but I knew he wasn't coming back." "There's more," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't let Mrs. Whitman be blindsided by the eviction papers. "There are also notices regarding the house, financial matters that need your attention." The elderly woman set down her teacup with deliberate care, and when she looked up, all pretense of dignity had stripped away, leaving only raw honesty. "You mean the foreclosure," she said. "Harold emptied our savings account before he left. Took out a second mortgage on the house without telling me. Spent the money on God knows what. Probably that young woman he's been seeing. His secretary from the insurance office." David felt something cold and familiar twist in his stomach. His own grandmother had faced similar circumstances 20 years ago, when his grandfather's gambling debts had consumed their family home. He remembered the same look of resigned devastation in her eyes, the way she tried to maintain dignity even as her world collapsed around her. "Mrs. Whitman," David said carefully, "have you been able to speak with an attorney about your options?" She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "With what money?" Harold made sure there was nothing left for attorneys or fighting or any of it. "I've been pretending everything was fine, telling neighbors I was just doing renovations when I sold my mother's china cabinet last month. But the truth is, I'm drowning, and there's no one throwing me a rope." Claire leaned forward, abandoning all professional protocol. "That's not true. There might be options we haven't considered. Legal aid, consumer protection laws, ways to challenge what your husband did." "And why would you help me?" Mrs. Whitman asked, studying Claire's face with sharp intelligence. "You work for the law firm handling my divorce. Helping me fight this hardly seems in your professional interest." Before Claire could answer, David spoke up. because some things matter more than professional interest. My grandmother lost her house to predatory lending practices. I was too young to help her then, but I'm not too young now. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling around them like evening shadows. Finally, Mrs. Whitman reached for the manila envelope. "Show me what I need to sign," she said. "At least then, I'll know exactly how bad things are." The Millbrook Community Center buzzed with the familiar energy of a Tuesday evening town council meeting. Claire hadn't planned to attend, but David had suggested they show up as a gesture of support for Mrs. Whitman, who sat in the front row wearing her best dress and the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. The meeting followed its usual pattern: reports on road maintenance, discussions about the annual fall festival, complaints about teenagers skateboarding in the town square. Claire found herself watching the dynamics of small-town politics, noticing how certain people commanded attention while others were politely ignored. Martha Jenkins held court near the back of the room, surrounded by her usual circle of concerned citizens. Claire couldn't hear the specific words, but Martha's gestures and the frequent glances toward Mrs. Whitman made the topic of conversation clear. "She's been spreading stories," David murmured, leaning close enough that Claire caught the faint scent of motor oil and soap that seemed to cling to him despite his clean shirt. "About suspicious activity at the Whitman house, about outside agitators stirring up trouble." "Outside agitators?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "You mean us?" Apparently a city lawyer and an outsider mechanic conspiring to help someone avoid legal obligations is exactly the kind of thing that threatens the social order. Claire watched Martha's animated conversation, feeling a familiar frustration building in her chest. This was exactly how it had started with her own family. Whispered conversations, people taking sides, neighbors choosing between loyalty and self-preservation. Town Council President Robert Hayes called for new business, and Martha Jenkins practically leaped to her feet. She'd been waiting for this moment, Claire realized, planning her presentation like a general preparing for battle. "I'd like to address concerns about property values in the historic district," Martha began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Specifically, the situation at 847 Maple Street, where certain parties have been observed encouraging resistance to legitimate legal proceedings." Mrs. Whitman's shoulders straightened, but she didn't turn around to face her accusers. Claire admired her composure even as she felt her own anger building. "Furthermore," Martha continued, "I think this community needs to consider the long-term implications of allowing outside interests to interfere with local property management. We've all worked hard to maintain Millbrook's character and property values." Robert Hayes shuffled through his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of Martha's comments. "Mrs. Jenkins, if you have specific concerns about legal proceedings, those should probably be addressed through appropriate channels rather than—" "I have very specific concerns," Martha interrupted, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "The Whitman property has been sold to Millbrook Development Corporation, which plans to restore it to its former glory. The current complications are delaying important improvements that will benefit the entire neighborhood." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Sold. Mrs. Whitman's house had already been sold, which meant the eviction wasn't just about foreclosure. It was about clearing the way for new owners who had already taken possession on paper. She glanced at David and saw her own shock reflected in his expression. Mrs. Whitman sat frozen in her chair, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "The Development Corporation has generously agreed to preserve the historic character of the house while modernizing it for contemporary use," Martha continued, "but they need clear title to proceed, which means resolving the current occupancy issues as quickly as possible." Robert Hayes looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Jenkins, this really isn't the appropriate forum for discussing private real estate transactions. It becomes public business when outside agitators encourage people to resist legitimate legal processes," Martha shot back. "We cannot allow Millbrook to become the kind of place where lawyers and their associates profit from preventing progress." The room had gone completely silent, all attention focused on the drama playing out in front of them. Claire felt dozens of eyes weighing her, judging her, deciding which side of this conflict deserved their support. David's garage occupied a narrow lot on the edge of downtown, squeezed between a hardware store and a vacant building that had once housed a bakery. The space was cramped but meticulously organized, with tools arranged on pegboard walls and parts sorted in labeled bins. The smell of motor oil and metal shavings created an oddly comforting atmosphere that reminded Claire of her father's construction workshop, back when he still had one. "I keep thinking about what Martha said last night," Claire said, perching on a stool beside David's workbench. "About the house being sold already. Mrs. Whitman didn't know, did she?" David wiped his hands on a shop rag, his expression grim. "I don't think so. The way she reacted, that wasn't someone who knew her house was already gone." He tossed the rag onto the workbench with more force than necessary. "This whole thing smells wrong, Claire. Divorces don't usually happen this fast, especially when there are significant assets involved. You think there's more to it than just a marriage falling apart?" "My gut says yes, but I can't prove anything." David leaned against the workbench, studying her face. "What's your professional opinion? Is this how Henderson usually handles divorce cases?" Claire had been asking herself the same question since the town council meeting. "Not usually, no. Most divorce cases drag on for months, especially when there's property involved. Both sides fight over every asset, every debt, every piece of furniture." She paused, thinking through the timeline. "But this case has been fast-tracked from the beginning. Mrs. Whitman's husband left 3 months ago, but the papers were only filed 6 weeks later, and now we're already at the service stage. That seems quick." "It's more than quick. It's suspicious." Claire slid off the stool and began pacing the small space, her mind working through possibilities. What if Harold Whitman didn't just abandon his wife? What if he was paid to leave? What if this whole divorce is designed to clear title to the house so these developers can take possession? David watched her pace, recognizing the intensity that had drawn him to her from their first meeting. She wasn't just processing information, she was building a case, connecting dots that others had missed. "If you're right," he said slowly, "then Mrs. Whitman isn't just losing her marriage and her house. She's the victim of a conspiracy designed to steal her property." "Exactly. And if we can prove it—" Claire stopped pacing abruptly as her phone rang. Henderson's name appeared on the screen, and she felt her stomach drop. "Claire Morrison," she answered, trying to keep her voice professional. "Morrison, where are you?" Henderson's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "I've had 3 calls this morning about your behavior at last night's town council meeting. I was there as a private citizen, Mr. Henderson, not representing the firm. Don't play word games with me. You were seen with the process server, discussing an active case in a public forum. Martha Jenkins says you were encouraging resistance to legal proceedings." Claire met David's eyes, seeing her own concern reflected there. "That's not what happened, sir. We were simply—" "I don't care what you think happened," Henderson interrupted. "What matters is how it looks to the community and to our clients. Millbrook Development Corporation is an important client, and they're concerned about delays in the Whitman matter." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Henderson's firm wasn't just handling Mrs. Whitman's divorce. They were representing the development company that planned to take her house. It was a conflict of interest so blatant that it bordered on legal malpractice. "Mr. Henderson," Claire said carefully, "are we representing both parties in this matter? Because that would require disclosure to Mrs. Whitman about potential conflicts of—" "You're not paid to give me legal advice, Morrison. You're paid to file papers and follow instructions. If you can't handle that level of responsibility, I'm sure I can find someone who can." The line went dead, leaving Claire staring at her phone with a mixture of anger and fear. Jobs in small towns were hard to find, especially for someone with student loans and no family safety net. But the alternative, participating in what looked more and more like fraud, made her feel sick. "Bad news?" David asked, though her expression had already answered his question. "Henderson represents the development company too. The whole firm is compromised." She sank back onto the stool, feeling the weight of impossible choices. "I think I'm about to lose my job." David moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Maybe losing the wrong job is the first step toward finding the right one. Easy for you to say. You have a business. I have student loans and rent. and no other prospects in this town. She looked up at him, seeing something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Why are you doing this, David? Why do you care what happens to Mrs. Whitman or me?" "Because 20 years ago, I watched my grandmother lose everything to people who had more money and better lawyers. I was 15 years old, and I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to help someone in the same situation, I wouldn't walk away." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about Mrs. Whitman and started being about you." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Claire felt her heart racing, torn between the attraction she'd been trying to ignore and the practical reality of their situation. Before she could respond, the garage's landline rang, shattering the moment. David answered it with obvious reluctance. "Chen's Auto Repair." He listened for a moment, his expression growing increasingly serious. "Yes, she's here. Hold on." He covered the receiver and looked at Claire. "It's Mrs. Whitman. She says it's urgent." Mrs. Whitman's voice trembled through the phone speaker as David held the receiver between them so Claire could hear. "I found something in Harold's desk drawer. Papers he left behind. I think you need to see them immediately." 20 minutes later, they sat in Mrs. Whitman's parlor while she spread documents across the coffee table with shaking hands. Bank statements, correspondence, and what looked like a contract filled the space between her teacup and a plate of untouched cookies. "I was looking for our marriage certificate," Mrs. Whitman explained, her voice steadier now that she had purpose. "The divorce papers require certain information, and I thought it might be in Harold's desk. That's when I found these." Claire picked up the first document, a bank statement from an account she'd never heard Mrs. Whitman mention. The balance showed a deposit of $50,000 made 2 weeks before Harold left, followed by a complete withdrawal 3 days later. "I didn't know this account existed," Mrs. Whitman said quietly. "Harold handled all our finances, said it was too complicated for me to worry about." She pointed to a letterhead at the top of another document. "But this one explains everything." David leaned over Claire's shoulder to read the contract, his breath warm against her ear. The document was from Millbrook Development Corporation, offering Harold Whitman $50,000 for consulting services related to property acquisition and development planning. The consulting period was listed as 6 months, beginning 2 weeks before Harold abandoned his marriage. "He was paid to leave you," Claire said, the words feeling surreal even as she spoke them. "They gave him money to create grounds for divorce so they could acquire the property through foreclosure." Mrs. Whitman nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks despite her composed expression. "There's more. Look at the signature page." At the bottom of the contract, beside Harold's familiar scrawl, was another signature that made Claire's blood run cold. Henderson had signed as a witness, and his law firm's address was listed as the contact for legal questions about the arrangement. "Henderson knew," David said, his voice tight with anger. "He's been representing both sides from the beginning, orchestrating the whole thing." Claire felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Mrs. Whitman, this is evidence of fraud. With these documents, we can stop the foreclosure, challenge the divorce, maybe even have Harold charged criminally." "But who would believe me?" Mrs. Whitman asked. "Harold's gone, Henderson has all the legal authority in this town, and I'm just an old woman who can't pay for her own attorney." David was already reaching for his phone. "I know someone who might help. My Uncle Thomas, he's a civil rights attorney in Philadelphia. He specializes in cases exactly like this." As David dialed, Claire studied the documents more carefully, her paralegal training kicking in despite her emotional involvement. The paper trail was damning, but it would require someone with serious legal credentials to challenge Henderson's firm effectively. "Uncle Thomas? It's David." His voice carried a note of humility that Claire hadn't heard before. "I know we haven't talked since Christmas, but I need your help with something important." The Henderson and Associates office felt different when Claire walked in Thursday morning, as if the familiar space had transformed overnight into enemy territory. Her desk looked the same. The Venetian blinds still cast the same golden stripes across the worn carpet, but everything felt charged with tension and impending confrontation. She'd spent most of the night thinking about what she was going to say, how she was going to present the evidence she discovered without destroying her career entirely. But as she sat down at her computer and saw Henderson emerge from his office with his usual coffee and dismissive expression, she realized there was no careful way to accuse your boss of orchestrating fraud. Morrison, Henderson called without looking in her direction. I need the Whitman files updated. The development company wants to expedite the foreclosure timeline. Actually, Mr. Henderson, I think we need to talk about the Whitman case. Claire stood up, the contract copies in her hand feeling like weapons she wasn't sure how to wield. I've discovered some information that raises serious ethical concerns. Henderson finally looked at her directly, and she saw something cold and calculating in his expression that she'd never noticed before. Ethical concerns? About a routine divorce and foreclosure? I think you're overstepping your boundaries, Morrison. Is it routine for the law firm handling a divorce to also represent the company acquiring the marital property? Because that seems like a textbook conflict of interest. Claire's voice was steadier than she'd expected, fueled by anger that overrode her fear. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't support. Henderson moved closer to her desk, his physical presence intimidating in the small space. Especially accusations against clients who contribute significantly to this firm's success. Claire placed the contract copies on her desk where Henderson could see them. Harold Whitman was paid $50,000 by Millbrook Development Corporation to abandon his marriage. You witnessed the contract. Your firm is representing both the wife in the divorce and the company that's stealing her property. Henderson's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a kind of cold resignation. You have no idea what you're meddling with, Morrison. This is a complex business arrangement that benefits everyone involved. Everyone except Mrs. Whitman, who's losing her home and doesn't even know why. Mrs. Whitman is an elderly woman who can't maintain a property of that size. The development company will preserve the historic character while making it useful again. Everyone wins. Everyone except the woman who's being defrauded out of her life's work. Claire felt her voice rising despite her efforts to stay professional. This isn't business, Mr. Henderson. It's theft with legal paperwork. Henderson walked to his office door and opened it wide. Clean out your desk, Morrison. You're terminated for insubordination and breach of client confidentiality. Security will escort you out in 15 minutes. The words hit her like physical blows, but Claire found herself oddly calm. I'll be reporting this to the State Bar Association, and I'll be encouraging Mrs. Whitman to file criminal charges against everyone involved. Good luck with that. By the time any investigation gets started, the Whitman matter will be resolved, and you'll be just another disgruntled former employee with unprovable accusations. Henderson's smile was sharp and confident. I've already contacted the other law firms in the county. Word gets around quickly in small legal communities about paralegals who can't maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The threat was clear. He was destroying her ability to work anywhere in the area. Claire felt 26 years of careful planning and student loan debt crashing down around her, but underneath the fear was something else: relief. She was finally free to fight back without worrying about professional consequences. David found her at Rosie's Diner 2 hours later, sitting in the same corner booth where they'd first planned to help Mrs. Whitman. Her cardigan was draped over the seat back, and she'd ordered coffee she wasn't drinking, staring out the window at the Main Street traffic as if she could find answers in the familiar rhythm of small-town life. Henderson called you, didn't he? She said without looking up as David slid into the opposite seat. He wanted to make sure I understood that my process-serving contract was contingent on staying away from disruptive influences. David's voice carried a mixture of anger and admiration. So I told him where he could put his contract. That made her look at him finally, and David saw something broken in her expression that made him want to fix everything that had hurt her. You didn't have to do that. One of us should keep their job. My Uncle Thomas is driving up from Philadelphia tonight. He's reviewed the documents you found, and he thinks we have a strong case for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of fiduciary duty. David reached across the table and covered her hand with his. We're going to fight this, Claire. All of us. With what money? I don't have savings for a legal battle, and Mrs. Whitman certainly doesn't. These people have resources we can't match. My uncle works pro bono on cases like this. Says it's good for his karma and bad for corrupt small-town lawyers. David's thumb traced across her knuckles, and Claire felt some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Besides, we have something they don't. What's that? We're right, and sometimes that matters more than money. Claire wanted to believe him, but years of watching her family lose everything to people with better lawyers had taught her that being right wasn't always enough. Still, sitting here with David's warm hand covering hers, she found herself thinking that maybe some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the outcome. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. I've never been unemployed, never been blacklisted, never had to start over completely. You're not starting over. You're starting better. David squeezed her hand gently. Henderson did you a favor by showing you who he really is. Now you get to choose who you want to be. The Millbrook Town Hall hadn't seen this much excitement since the controversial vote on the new traffic light 3 years ago. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, drawn by word-of-mouth reports that something dramatic was about to happen at the emergency council meeting. Mrs. Whitman sat in the front row again, but this time she wasn't alone. Thomas Chen commanded attention even sitting still, a tall man in an expensive suit whose presence suggested he was accustomed to being heard and taken seriously. Claire sat beside Mrs. Whitman, her professional uncertainty replaced by the focused intensity of someone with a mission. David stood near the back of the room, close enough to provide support but far enough away to avoid becoming a distraction. He watched Claire with something approaching awe, seeing how she transformed her personal devastation into fuel for fighting back. Robert Hayes called the meeting to order with obvious reluctance. We're here tonight because Mrs. Eleanor Whitman has requested an opportunity to address the council regarding the development of 847 Maple Street. Martha Jenkins started to stand, clearly prepared to object, but Thomas Chen was already moving toward the front of the room with the kind of confident authority that made objections seem petty and pointless. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I'm Thomas Chen, representing Mrs. Whitman in what we believe is a case of systematic fraud designed to illegally acquire her property. His voice carried clearly through the packed room, and Claire noticed how conversation stopped and attention focused on him completely. Mrs. Whitman has recently discovered evidence that her husband was paid to abandon their marriage by the same development company that now claims ownership of her house. Furthermore, the law firm handling her divorce has been secretly representing both parties in direct violation of legal ethics. Martha Jenkins was on her feet immediately. This is outrageous. These are wild accusations designed to delay legitimate business proceedings. Actually, Mrs. Jenkins, these are documented facts supported by bank records, contracts, and witness testimony. Thomas Chen opened his briefcase and removed copies of the evidence they'd gathered. Harold Whitman was paid $50,000 by Millbrook Development Corporation to create grounds for divorce and property seizure. The room erupted in surprised murmurs and heated conversations. Robert Hayes banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, while Martha Jenkins stood near her seat, looking like she'd been physically slapped. Furthermore, Thomas continued once the noise died down, we've discovered that a deed restriction from 1892 requires a supermajority vote from neighboring property owners before this house can be demolished or significantly altered. No such vote has ever been taken. Claire felt her heart racing as she watched the faces in the crowd. Some people looked shocked, others angry, and a few seemed to be calculating how this development might affect their own property values. But what mattered was that people were listening, really listening, for the first time since this whole situation began. Henderson appeared at the back of the room, moving through the crowd with obvious agitation. When he reached the front, his face was flushed with anger and something that looked like panic. These accusations are completely unfounded, Henderson announced, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. My firm has acted within all ethical guidelines, and any suggestion otherwise is simply the desperate act of a terminated employee seeking revenge. Thomas Chen smiled with the kind of confidence that comes from holding all the winning cards. Mr. Henderson, I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to present that defense to the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. They're very interested in reviewing your firm's handling of this matter. The room went completely silent, and Claire realized that everyone was staring at Henderson, waiting for his response. For the first time since she'd known him, He looked uncertain, vulnerable, caught in something he couldn't intimidate or manipulate his way out of. In the meantime, Thomas continued, we're requesting that all proceedings related to 847 Maple Street be suspended pending a full investigation of the circumstances surrounding this property acquisition. Robert Hayes looked around the room as if hoping someone else would take responsibility for the decision. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke carefully. Given the serious nature of these allegations, I think the prudent course is to table any decisions related to the Maple Street property until these matters can be properly investigated. The motion carried by a unanimous voice vote, and Claire felt something like victory flowing through her veins. It wasn't over. There would be investigations and legal proceedings and probably months of uncertainty, but for the first time in weeks, Mrs. Whitman's house was safe. As people began filing out of the meeting, Mrs. Whitman reached over and squeezed Claire's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought anyone would believe me." David made his way through the crowd to reach them, and when Claire looked up at him, she saw pride and affection and something deeper that made her breath catch. They'd won the first battle, but more importantly, they'd found something worth fighting for together. The golden hour light streaming through the windows of 847 Maple Street painted everything with warmth and possibility. Mrs. Whitman moved around her kitchen with renewed energy, preparing tea for the three people who had helped save her home. The house felt different now, not like a place under siege, but like a sanctuary where justice had finally found its footing. The State Bar Association has suspended Henderson's license pending their investigation, Thomas Chen reported, accepting a cup of tea with the kind of gentle courtesy that reminded Claire why David spoke of his uncle with such respect. And the district attorney's office is reviewing criminal charges against both Henderson and Harold Whitman. Mrs. Whitman settled into her favorite chair, the late afternoon sun highlighting the silver in her hair and the peaceful expression that had replaced weeks of fear and uncertainty. What about the development company? Their contract with Harold was invalidated the moment we proved it was based on fraudulent premises. They have no legal claim to the property. Thomas smiled at Claire. Your documentation skills made this case much easier to prove than it might have been otherwise. Claire felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea or the sunshine. I just did what felt right. That's exactly why you're going to be an excellent legal aid coordinator, Mrs. Whitman said, producing a letter from the town library. Margaret Thompson called this morning. The position is yours if you want it. David looked up from his tea, surprise and delight evident on his face. Legal aid coordinator? Helping people navigate bureaucratic challenges, understanding their rights, connecting them with resources, Claire explained, feeling excitement building as she spoke. It's not traditional legal work, but it's exactly what I wanted to do when I first decided to study law. It's exactly what you were meant to do, David said quietly, and something in his voice made Claire's heart skip. Thomas Chen excused himself to make some phone calls, leaving the three of them alone in the peaceful parlor. Outside, the ancient oak trees whispered in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the passage of time in the way small towns have measured their days for generations. I have something for both of you, Mrs. Whitman said, disappearing into another room and returning with a small wooden box. Harold left this behind, probably because he thought it was worthless. But I know better. Inside the box was a deed, not to the house, but to a small lot behind it, where Harold had planned to build a garage years ago. It's not much, Mrs. Whitman said, but it's enough space for a small office. If you're going to help people with legal problems, you'll need somewhere to meet with them. Claire stared at the deed, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gesture and the possibilities it represented. Mrs. Whitman, we can't accept this. Of course you can. You saved my home. The least I can do is help you build yours. She looked from Claire to David with the kind of knowing smile that suggested she saw more than they'd realized they were revealing. Besides, I have a feeling this town is going to need advocates who understand that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing to do. David moved closer to Claire, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence like a promise of support and partnership. What do you think? He asked. Ready to hang out your own shingle? Claire looked around the room that had become the center of her transformation, from rule follower to advocate. from employee to entrepreneur. The late afternoon light painted everything golden, and she realized that sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted was the first step toward finding everything you actually needed. I think, she said, reaching for David's hand, that we've got work to do. Outside, the Victorian house stood solid and beautiful against the evening sky, no longer a symbol of loss and vulnerability, but a testament to what was possible when people chose to stand together against those who would tear down what mattered most. The legal battle wasn't over, the investigations would take months, and building a new practice would require more faith than money. But sitting here with David's strong hand in hers and Mrs. Whitman's grateful smile warming the room, Claire knew that some victories were worth more than security, some fights were worth more than safety, and some partnerships were worth more than all the professional success she thought she wanted. The golden light faded slowly, replaced by the soft glow of lamplight and the comfortable silence of people who had found their place in the world by choosing to make room for others to find theirs too.